Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. The horrific abuse of Marie Antoinette, the executed French queen. When Marie Antoinette was led to the guillotine for her execution in Paris, thousands lined the streets to catch a glimpse of the most hated woman in France. She was a queen who was a widow after her husband, King Louis XVI, had lost his head on the very same execution device. But throughout the final months of her life, she was subjected to some harrowing treatment at the hands of her captors, and the evidence that came forward about her at trial was scandalous and shocking. She was a woman who could have easily been saved by European dynasties and monarchies at times, but ultimately she would be executed at the behest of revolutionaries who at one point did not know what to do with her. But her treatment was horrific, and today we will look at this. To the people of France, Marie Antoinette was reviled, and she was hated hugely. She was a woman who was lavishly living whilst the French people were starving. And because of this, revolutionary ideas would emerge. People began to challenge the monarchy and what they stood for, and the decision would change the course of history forever. Marie Antoinette would be arrested, along with her royal family, and they were practically held under house arrest. To begin with, they were held in the Tuileries, a large palace, and a mob would break in here on the 20th of June 1792 and would force the king to wear the bonnet rouge. Marie Antoinette, during this, caught the brunt of the insults, as she would be attacked by the rebels, and she was accused of betraying France, and many threatened to kill her. But the palace would later be stormed by the mob, and they would slaughter the Swiss guards. But then on the 13th of August, the royal family were moved into the Tower of the Temple, a medieval prison in France, and the conditions here were said to have been much harsher than the previous place. One by one, the attendants of the royal family and the servants would disappear, including Marie Antoinette's great friend, Marie-Louise de Lamballe, who would be brutally slaughtered by revolutionaries who paraded her head on a pike throughout Paris. They even took this to the temple for Marie Antoinette to see, and when she heard of this, she fainted. It was a very tough time for her, and when the monarchy fell, when a republic was officially declared, the royal family's name became known as the captors, and her husband was then taken to trial. Louis XVI would be condemned to death following his trial, and he was executed on the guillotine on the 21st of January 1793. With the fall of the guillotine blade onto her husband's neck, Marie Antoinette was now a widow, and her treatment inside of the temple did not let up, and there was no sympathy for her. She became known as Widow Capet, and was not referred to at all as a queen, and she hoped that her son, Louis Charles, would soon become the king, and monarchists would recognise him as Louis XVII. There were talks about breaking the royal family out of the temple, and that Marie Antoinette and her son would return to power. However, Marie did get some sympathy, but this was all to no avail, as there would be very few plots to break her from prison which would amount to anything. Inside of the Tower of the Temple, Marie's treatment continued to be strict and severe. Her guards would smoke, and they would actively blow smoke into her face, and strict measures were taken to make sure that she could not communicate to anyone in the outside world. Some of her guards were open to bribery, but then the question emerged as to what to do with Marie Antoinette. Some members of the National Convention wanted her exchanged for French prisoners of war, but others advocated for her death or execution. The Reign of Terror had swept through France, and thousands of heads were being cut off, and because of this, Marie's head would be next. But whilst in prison, she was subjected to more horror, as her son Louis Charles, who was considered the Dauphin and heir to the throne, or Louis XVII, as mentioned earlier, was separated from her. The revolutionaries wanted to retrain the boy in the revolutionary ideas, and they would turn him against his mother, and he was subjected to a harrowing ordeal of abuse at the hands of his captors. He would be beaten daily, and his mother could hear his screams and shouts. But when he was taken away from her, there was a struggle, and Marie would fight to keep him. But this was not the case, and she would spend every minute of her imprisonment trying to catch a glimpse of her son. But then things would get even more, as she was sent to the conciergerie, which was considered the last stop before the guillotine. It was said to have been the antechamber to the guillotine, but when she left the temple, she would bump her head on the door, but she remained defiant. It was clear that she was broken. Inside the conciergerie, things were worse, and she was under constant surveillance, and Marie would have no privacy at all from her guards. She was forced to undress in front of them, and they would jeer and cheer and act shockingly towards her. But then Marie Antoinette's trial would come, and she was accused of a huge number of accusations. This included organising orgies at the Palace of Versailles, sending money from the royal treasury to Austria to support the war against the French, and she was also shockingly accused of incest, with her son, Louis Charles, making this claim. He was pressurised to do so. This was, of course, horrific for the Queen to endure. Marie would be shocked when this was revealed to the courtroom, and she asked all the mothers who were present to ignore this. But she would be deemed guilty of the three main charges: of depleting the national treasury, of conspiracy against the security of the state, and also high treason. For many months and years she had been treated very harshly, and what came next was her hastily arranged execution. For Marie Antoinette, she must have thought that her death would be a lifting of her suffering and relief. This was also the case with Mary, Queen of Scots, during Elizabeth I's reign, who had been imprisoned for almost 2 decades. She went to her execution calmly, as she believed that she would be a queen again in heaven. But Marie would still be treated roughly by the guards. Before the execution, she was forced to undress and change in front of her guards, and was forced to wear a plain white dress despite wanting to wear black. Her guards then roughly cut her hair with scissors to make sure the blade would not get trapped in her hair when it fell. But her ordeal was not over, as when she was taken to her execution, she was forced to once again go out in front of the jeering crowds, and she had a leash placed around her neck like a dog, and she was put on a cart and taken to her execution place, the Place de la Revolution. The crowds threw things and shouted insults at her, but Marie remained calm. When she was on the execution scaffold, she remained calm, and following her head being taken clean off, her body was then hastily buried in an unmarked grave in the Madeleine Cemetery, and she was deprived of her status as a royal in her burial. Despite Marie Antoinette, the French queen, being a figure of ridicule in France, she was a woman who was not treated with dignity at all in her imprisonment. She was subjected daily to embarrassment and horrific ordeals at the hands of her captors, and she was also a woman who was a European princess at the end of the day. She would see her execution as a release from the ordeal she was subjected to, and she was given a very rough ride of it during her time at the various different prisons. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.